Hi, and welcome to this session and rehearsal about what's new with Microsoft Graph in May 2018. Um, my name is Vincent Bire. I'm an Office Servers and Services MVP. I also work as an Azure and Office 365 developer at Lead, a Canadian-based consulting company. If you want to reach me, you can find my blog URL, you can find my Twitter handle, and you will also find my email address on the presentation later. So, who is that session for? Um, a bit of everybody actually. First and foremost, it's oriented towards developers that want to know more about the new capabilities of a Microsoft Graph that came out over the last year or so. It is also oriented towards business deciders that want to know about those new capabilities and what it means in terms of business, as well as citizen developers um, that want to tweak their small automation projects or productivity projects and get to know more about the Microsoft Graph. Also, IT pros will find some things interesting about managing devices, users, passwords, policies, and so on and so forth. So today's agenda, it's pretty packed actually. Microsoft Graph team is not taking any rest. They're delivering a lot of content and services and data endpoints. So we are starting right now by a small introduction, and then we will recap what is a Microsoft Graph because I want to make sure everybody's on the same page regarding that. And then the next thing we'll talk about is authentication, authorization, and identity. And then we'll talk about different workloads like SharePoint and OneDrive and what's new with them in terms of graph exposure. Same thing for any kind of teamwork related workloads. We'll talk about Outlook and specifically about sending and receiving emails, the calendar, the tasks, and a few other things. We'll talk about general service improvements, things that make our lives as developers easier at large on on the Graph API at large. And we'll talk about lots of other new things that I could not fit in specific categories, and we won't have time to spend dedicated time to those. But I still wanted to mention those in case it might be interesting for you. And finally, it will be time to say goodbye and to reach a conclusion. So the way I usually like to lead my sessions, I want them to be interactive so you don't fall asleep, so you understand properly. So I will ask you questions, I will ask you for feedback during the session. Feel free to ask me questions as well. It's always better when there is some kind of back and forth and you get the best content out of it. Of course, this is a pre-recording for the rehearsal, so no feedback, no attendees, but I will do without that. All right, so let's dive in. Let's talk about the Microsoft Graph. The idea is that Microsoft has been investing a lot over the last years for developers, but also citizen developers and third parties, right? But also for themselves because it is also quote unquote an internal API. And they wanted to bring a unified API for all workloads across Office 365 and Azure, mostly Azure Active Directory. One reason why you want to care about that, this is a recording of me scrolling across um, the last year's set of changes through the changelog. And you can see that I've been already talking for 20 seconds and I'm scrolling very fast and now only made it through half of it. And this goes for the probably something like 40 seconds or 50 seconds. Um, of course, those are not net new APIs that didn't exist at all before. They might be added properties, things that were promoted from beta to V1, things that were improved, or any kind of or net new things that didn't exist before. But still, you can see all the investments Microsoft has been putting together over the last year, it's consequent, and to me that's an important part of a strategy of Microsoft strategy over the last few years. So this is why you should. This is one of the reasons you should care about it. Another reason why you should care about that, and I would like to thank Yina Arenas for sending me the updated slide with updated numbers, because I used to have an old slide with old numbers, is the adoption and the size of what you can get from the Microsoft Graph. So first, 90% of the Fortune 500 companies have data exposed through the Microsoft Graph because they use Office 365. It might be not for all the workloads, might be not for all the company, but still they do have some data there that you can leverage, build solution for, and provide value to them, and of course like make money out of it. We're talking about 65 million mobility suite. So that's the mobility suite that includes things like devices management, identity management, security, also productivity tools, and so on and so forth. So that's a lot of people using and being set up for Office 365 and the Microsoft Graph. Um, when we're talking about monthly active users, so that's not only EMS, that's Office 365 at large. Those are people that use one of the workloads of Office 365 at least once a month. So it might not be a tremendous activity, but still they are doing one thing or a couple of things every month, right? And we're talking about 135 million people doing that and connecting to Office 365 every month. So that's a huge user base that you can reach. 181 countries, so in case you want to have a global scale and reach across the globe. And every month we have 450 billions authentication requests going through. So that can seem a lot, but sometimes, when you need something in Outlook and then something in SharePoint, and let's say you use Teams and it talks to different workloads, right? That can count as many times, but still, you can see that those APIs and those services are built at scale, and they are designed to handle like tremendous workloads that we would probably not be able to sustain in-house with a set of servers or custom-built APIs. And each month we have more than 1 billion meetings to focus on Outlook and Exchange are being scheduled. So again, like at scale, global, lots of data, and touching a lot of different users. All right, so that's on the impact size and on the investment on the strategy. In terms of when I talk about workloads, here's some examples of those from the far left on top. We can talk about OneDrive, we can talk about Excel, we can talk about Azure Active Directory, of course Planner on the far right, but also Exchange, which is a backend service for Outlook, and includes things like calendars and messages. On the far left at the bottom, Microsoft Teams, the youngest team member of all. And the other things we can see as well that are interesting because they are not that known are, for example, Intune, which is the logo with two screens, with a computer screen and a phone screen. Those APIs are set to manage things like identity, policies, devices, things like is the device secure, does it have an antivirus, does it have a password for locking the device, is it joined to the domain, all those kind of things, right? You can manage and address through an API. The other one is SharePoint, of course everybody knows SharePoint, right? And the far right one is Project Rome. We'll talk more about that later on, but it's a really cool set of APIs and OS capabilities and SDKs that is designed to have a seamless capability across the board and a seamless experience. In terms of capabilities, the graph, and we'll extend on that throughout the session, but the graph has a set of different capabilities that are, for example, it's able to provide you with webhooks. So the idea of, hey, I want to subscribe to whatever changes are going to this and that specific, for example, new messages coming in, new meetings being scheduled, new files coming to SharePoint, all those kind of things. You might be interested into subscribing to those and being notified as an API, and do react on those and do a few things, right? Well, the graph offers that. When we talk about OData as well, so OData is a protocol based on top of REST and HTTP. And the idea is to be able to do some data manipulation from the data source, so you don't have to do that on your end or to get all the data across the wire. Things like projections with selecting columns, things like filtering, things like batching operations, and so on and so forth. So it's compliant. Delta API. So that's super useful, and we'll extend on that for synchronization scenarios. Things like, hey, last time I went to check that, this was the state. What changed since last time? Basically, give me the changes. And open or schema extensions. So the idea of, yes, there are messages, there are events, and so on and so forth, and they have a set of defined properties, but I might want to extend those to add my line of business properties to those elements, and to augment it, and so on and so forth, right? When you want to talk to a graph, of course, you can craft HTTP requests manually, and that works perfectly, but you can also leverage SDKs, and here is a set of SDKs and languages you can find that are available as wrappers to talk to the graph. It will save you a lot of time. You probably know most of them, like C#, JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, Java, PHP, Ruby, and Android and iOS. Keep in mind that some are not, they are still in preview, so they don't have production support, and those ones are Java, iOS, and Android that are still in preview as of today. All right, let's talk about authentication now and authorization. All right, we have two sessions at the Techorama. The next one is tomorrow in room 14, I believe. Authentication and authorization could be a whole subject by itself, and it's a pretty complex subject. So I decided to skip it. So come see me tomorrow, and we'll talk that more in depth tomorrow in room 14, I believe. Next subject is identity and membership. So what changed in that is the people API came to V1 or release, and that API is actually an evolution of the working with Insight, and it aggregates data from lots of different data sources, not only Azure Active Directory, which is traditionally the workload for handling not only authentication and authorization, but also identity at large and membership and permissions to some extent, but also from your Outlook contacts, from the people you communicate with using email or instant messaging, people you collaborate with SharePoint and OneDrive for Business, and those, like the people that surface here, are through some machine learning mechanisms and so on, suggested to be relevant to the user and say, hey, that person is interesting. Maybe you should add their contact, or well, just see it at hand, basically. The way to get that is you can query on get/me/people, and here is a sample of what you get out of a box. You get things like the name, surname, the job title, email address, phone numbers, websites, and so on and so forth. The new additions to the identity workloads are webhook supports for users in group. So the idea is you can now subscribe to user property changes or group property changes or group creations or group deletion or user addition or deletion. And that's actually very useful for scenarios like provisioning and onboarding, right? Let's say you want to automate some people coming into the company. What you could technically do is build an application or an API that subscribe to the webhook on users and say, hey, a new user came in, and maybe you can look up. So your IT is going to create the user in your Azure Active Directory, right? Assign all the metadata, things like um, the surname, the last name, and so on and so forth, the email address, blah, blah, blah. We're going to create that. And what you could automate with that is look up, for example, the department information and give them access to the portal for that department, give them access to a set of teams relevant to their job title. So for let's say they are software engineers, maybe you want them to have access to all the software engineer like design pattern discussions, like deployment discussions, those kind of things, and you could automate all of that thanks to that webhook. The other addition that came to V1 is lifecycle policies on groups. So when you create groups, well, as an administrator, you can set up policies on group creation that says that dictates the privacy and also when are they going to expire and then be decommissioned or archived, all those kind of things, right? You can set up. The idea is those policies now are exposed via an API, so you could. That's more for a product-based thing. You could automate creating policies and assigning them or updating them, right? Also, something that came to beta endpoint thanks to the whole GDPR mess that's gonna start being in effect in a few days. It's the terms of use API. So you have a way now to first define certain terms of use for different things you would like to use in Office 365 or outside of it. And once that is defined, it also helps you keeping tracks of when a user accepted those terms of use, which version, at what date, and so on and so forth, right? So it's more like a way to keep track of those legal concerns, basically. All right, moving on. The next workload we'll be talking about are the ones related to file sharing and collaboration, so basically SharePoint and OneDrive. The first thing that came in that was a long ask is the lists and site APIs and we came to V1. So the idea is you can access SharePoint lists and document libraries as well as columns and site columns and content types, and as well as read write custom metadata on list items via the Microsoft Graph. And this is to solve an issue that you had access to most of the files through previous APIs releases in SharePoint via the OneDrive APIs that were compatible for SharePoint. But once you had the file, you could not do anything with it in the sense that you could not change its metadata or even change the structure of what was stored in SharePoint, and what was very limiting. The learning curve was, okay, I have this very simple and standard API, which is the Graph API, and once I want to go to the next step, I have to switch gears, either talk to a SharePoint REST API or CSOM or JSOM, and maybe that's going to have impact on the authentication and authorization model, and so on and so forth, right? So all those considerations were a steep learning curve to go from, hey, I'm manipulating the file to, oh, I just want to add some metadata, and also make the link between the file I'm manipulating, which metadata are related to that. That's now way easier because it came to the graph. And one of the way you do that is you can query from v1 slash site slash site ID and then lists and give list ID, and then you get all the metadata around that, things like what columns does that list have, things like what items it exposes, and so on and so forth, right? Same thing with the site APIs. So Currently, the sites API returns team sites and their properties and relationships and so on and so forth. And by team site, I mean SharePoint team site. Don't mean necessarily only teams related to SharePoint site, which are basically the same, just they are tied to a group and so on and so forth. Again, that API supports different primary keys like the site collection host name, the site collection GUID, the site GUID, and the way you can access that if it is an Office 365 unified group, just by saying group ID /site /root, and you will access that, or using /site /root or /site some kind of ID, you can access that as well. The other thing that came out to V1 around OneDrive is dedicated permissions management. So they improved the way you can give permissions to applications and delegate permissions to applications to have a more granular control for those sort of things. The activity thing, Project Rome, we'll come back to that. File version history. So now you have a way to access with a Microsoft Graph to the file versions history. See how many versions, when they were updated, by whom, can I get the binaries, and so on and so forth. So it's very useful for things like building I don't know, recovery feature in your application, or just giving insights about the last changes, and so on and so forth, right? Um, Also, of course, because we have a site relationship through these list API and so on and so forth, we get the SharePoint item relationship when it's here. And in beta, so not production ready, we have a way to manage sharing links. So I don't know if you are aware, but in SharePoint and OneDrive, when you have a file, you can say, hey, I want to share it. One of the ways to share that file is to create what we call a sharing link, which is associated with policies, permissions, and potentially an expiration date, and that you can give to a person, and the person can access that content without having an account, without having to log on, depending on the policies, of course, right? But well, now you can create those programmatically, even though it's still in beta. And you also have a way to convert any Office file format to PDF. So let's say you have the address of a PowerPoint file. If you append question mark format equals PDF, and so far as I know, this is the only format that is supported, you will get a PDF conversion of that file. So it's very handy if you want to do printouts, or for any kind of scenarios where you have digital contracts management, where you want to have a PDF version sent out to a customer, all those kind of scenarios. Another thing that came to beta is the thumbnails generation. So the thumbnails are basically a preview of a file's content, so you can display nice views to your users, and now the beta endpoint supports that. Also, another thing that came is new insights that are recent items, so things that the user recently changed, modified, opened, and so on, as well as shared with me. So things that I don't own, but that are shared with me, and that enables discovery scenarios. And we'll see more about that in the general section. And you can also do search with the dollar filter. That's limited to the current drive that you're exploring with OneDrive API, or use the search API that searches across the board and is a bit broader. All right, now let's talk about teamwork. And I swear you will have demos soon. It's just that we don't have the time to demo everything. So teamwork is basically Teams and Outlook, the way you want to communicate with people, schedule things, and so on and so forth. And if we talk about the underlying technical layer or fabric of the teams. It relies on groups and unified groups that came out a couple of years ago now. The good thing is those groups now have an API, so you can address that and crawl them, and you can filter the difference between unified groups from security groups, from distribution groups, and so on, using the OData filter capabilities, for example. And it once you have a group, because the way the Microsoft Graph is built is kind of recursive, or they want to enable you to traverse the content and go by a pending URL path, go from the group to the drive to the file to the author of a file to the organization is part of, and so on and so forth. Once you have a group, you have effectively access to, well, the drive associated to that, which is the SharePoint site, well, the SharePoint site from a files perspective, the calendar, the lists, the site, the notes, and so on and so forth. They also provided a mention API. Still, this one is still beta. So the idea is across different Microsoft workloads, you have ways to mention people in Outlook. You can do that in Yammer, but the Yammer is its own thing. You have that in Teams and so on. And the idea of that application, of that API on the long run, is to provide a centralized way to see all the mentions across the board, and provide also deep links of where the content is stored and where the context is coming from. As of today, it's limited to emails, so only mentions in Outlook will work. Well, will show up here, and the way you can get those is you can query against get/me/messages, and you can select the mentions preview attributes if you want to see the mentions on a message, or you can also get the mentions /mention path. Another thing that came out is the Team API, which is in beta today, and we'll demonstrate that soon. So Microsoft Teams, the newcomer in Office 365, is a kind of a chat-based collaboration system, and it's built on top of Office 365 groups. So anything you want to access besides the chat was already there with the group APIs and the other APIs related to that. Now, thanks to this API, you also have access to different teams, the different settings for the teams, the different members for the teams, the channels in there, and the threads, and then the subsequent workloads thanks to the group's API. And the way that works is you can create a thread, for example, posting on the /group/ID/channels/ID of a channel/chat threads, or you can get all the channels for the certain team like that, so you're running that request. And here's our first demo after 20 minutes of just talking. So what I'm going to demonstrate here is creating a thread in Teams. So here I have this team, which is the DevOps Talk general channel, and here we have already a few set of threads and messages. Here I'm going to open what we call the Graph Explorer. It's a great tool to demonstrate and kind of play with the graph and sometimes prove a few things and so on and so forth. So the way this is going to work is we need to send a post message on a beta endpoint. Today it's a beta endpoint, and because I'm lazy at typing, I'm gonna get the URL from here. Bear with me a second. Here, so here's the group, here's the group ID, here's the team endpoint or the team API channels, here is the channel ID, and here's the chat threads. And we also need to give the payload. So this is going to be our payload, like that. And let's run it. Success. All right, now let's talk about messaging and scheduling, and we'll be mostly talking about Outlook. One of the things that is super useful and a new endpoint capability they provided with some machine learning is the find meeting time API, and now it's V1. So um, it allows you to find availability between two users. Let's say I want to organize a meeting with you, and we're part of the same organization today because it's limited to that today. And I have right to see at least some of your availability on your calendar. But I don't want to go through the back and forth of saying, "Hey, John, are you available on Tuesday morning or Wednesday, or what do you think? It's just for an hour, blah blah blah." I don't want to go through that conversation that can be time consuming, right? Um, well, there is this API, and this is what it does. It is highly configurable, so you can say to that API, "Hey, we're looking between those actors during working hours, or during out of office hours, or doing any kind of type of hours." It is also configurable in terms of a minimum percentage of participants that have to be available to consider a time slot as valid. The idea is, let's say I want to organize a meeting with 10 people. We know we're super busy, so it's probably most likely that I'm never going to find a time slot with those 10 people, at least not before weeks or months. So maybe like if I only have 8 of those people, so 80%, I'm okay with it. So I can say that to the find meeting time endpoint. I can also say is the organizer, so the current user, optional, and so that's very useful if you have some kind of assistant or executives that are scheduling something for other people, but they won't be attending that. You can also give it location constraints, so close to that meeting room or this meeting room, to make sure that if you have if you have let's say you're organizing a day of meetings or a week of meetings, and it's kind of a conference or an offsite or something like that, this tool is not suggesting you meeting rooms that are across the building or something like that, right? You can also, well, of course, you have to provide a meeting duration, and this is how it works. I'm gonna demonstrate that later. Um, Also in V1, you can now have access to follow-up flags. So the flags that you have on, you can flag on messages to say, hey, maybe I have to get back to that later. You can now set up multiple locations for events. So when you create an event in Exchange, you can say it's gonna be happening in meeting room A, B, and C. So if it's a big thing, everything is booked with one meeting. You don't have to struggle creating multiple meetings. You now have support for categories. So in Outlook, I'm not using those a lot, but in Outlook you have this notion of categories that come with colors, and you can associate rules to that, and so on and so forth. Well, you can access those programmatically through the graph now, so that's also good. You have access to mail folders, mail rules, so all the automatic rules that you know move that email from that folder to this folder, send out an automatic reply, mark it as read, and so on. All those automatic rules, you can set it up. But you also have access now to settings. So again, this one is very useful for onboarding scenarios. Let's say we create a new user, again for our new user scenario. What you want to do, maybe because you know what office branch they'll be working at, maybe you want to set up their um, email time zone and even meeting time zone to be the time zone of a location automatically, so they don't have to set it up for you, well, themselves. And same thing for languages and so on and so forth. You have access to the email headers, super useful for any kind of spam tracking or validation or security validation application. And you also have access to calendar permissions, so again, super useful for sharing stuff automatically and so on and so forth. In beta, they also added a few things that they're testing out, things like finding a meeting room. So as you can find a meeting time, and now you can find meeting rooms that are more likely to be closer, and so on and so forth. Management of Outlook tasks. So that was a long ask request, right? Because People wanted to be able to address and manage Outlook tasks because a lot of people are still doing, including myself, and using Outlook tasks, so that was very important. Managing the out of office replies. Let's say your business goes closes during the holiday period of time. You want to make sure that everybody has an out of office reply, which is often forgotten, right? And you want to make sure that it's the same for everybody with the corporate logo and everything. Well, now you can set it up at large, as well as working hours. So you can say, okay, everybody is working from 9 to 5, or this person is working at night shift, or those kind of things. You can set that up automatically. Again, onboarding scenarios and provisioning portals, super useful, those kind of APIs. So for this demo, I'm going to demonstrate the fine meeting time. So the way that works, you have to issue a post again here. Oops, sorry about that. First we'll hit V1, and here I'm going to do that. I'm going to copy something else while I'm at it. So here is the payload you want to send. I cannot make that bigger, but here the idea is I want to organize a meeting between myself and my brother here, and we don't have any location constraint because we are a virtual company, so it doesn't matter much. But we want to find a meeting time between the 18th of June and the 20th of June, and that meeting is going to be lasting 2 hours. I also want suggestions to be returned. I'll show what that is later on. And in order for a time slot to be valid, because we're only two on the meeting, I want 100% of the attendees to be present. Let's run this request. What the graph is going to come up with is a set of different time slots here, and a reason. And sometimes the reason can vary depending on different parameters, but this is something that, for example, you can display to your user and so on, right? You also get a confidence indicator. So how confident is Outlook that everybody is going to be available at the time? That's also useful to sort those out and to display the most confident to the user, for example, and those kind of things, right? All right, let's go back to the slides. Let's talk about service improvements now. So the first one that came to my mind is the OData batch capability. So the idea of being able to batch requests, it means you want to be able to send multiple requests bundled in one HTTP request. This is especially useful for performances on low latency networks, because your client might lose connection, or it's slow because you're on a phone or on a remote location, right? You don't want to be sending many requests back and forth and waiting for those every time. You want to send a set of requests and get the result, and that's going to be much faster. You can, when you batch things, you can to some extent chain requests. If I want, for example, to create a message and then reuse the message ID to tag it with a category or with a follow-up flag, I can use those kind of tokens to make sure those are first in the right order. Second, reusing one another's parameter, right? And at this point in time, there's no SDK support for that. So if you want to use it, you have to craft a request manually. But what it looks like basically is like that. Here is our batch request that contains a set of different requests. The first one being, hey, I want to get the content of a file, so give me that. And then I want to get the tasks that are assigned to me in Planner, so get me that. And then get me the events for this specific ID, for this specific group, sorry. And then I want to update the city of my city actually where I live in, in the graph and in my profile, right? All of that is going to be executed at once, and you will get the results saying, hey, request 1 went well, request 2 maybe failed for some reason, here's the content for request 3, and so on and so forth. This one is super useful for developers. The dollar what if is actually super interesting. It's a way for you, it tells to the graph, okay, thank you for giving me the data, but I also want an explanation on what's going on, where is the data coming from, and what steps you went through to get me that data. So it's super useful for debugging scenarios and developers. Um, as I said that, so how it works, for any request you append question mark dollar what if, and you will get a description of, for example, here we are getting on slash me, so we want the profile for the current user, and that's actually because the graph is not storing anything all the time, it's reaching to the subsequent workloads. That's actually executing against the AAD graph, which is a previous version of graph that was built for Azure Active Directory, and it's executing that specific request with that specific method, and so on and so forth, right? So very important. So for example, if you don't, when you're so on slash me, if you don't know why, where, like is the, for example, the location information coming from SharePoint, from AAD, from Skype for Business status, even if Skype for Business is not exposed in the graph, well, that tells you that actually comes from AAD and not, nowhere else, right? So you know how to tell your users how to update that later on. The next one, well, webhooks, we already talked about that, but Delta API is very useful, as I mentioned earlier. The idea is more resources are supported now than they used to before, and you have filtering capabilities to make it to trim the data and the data you're tracking to smaller sets and more precise sets. Again, the way you do that is adding slash delta. You'll get oh, actually, I'm gonna do a demo right after. Um, Webhooks, the idea is to be again notified for changes in on specific resources, um, and the idea is they added new resources, more filtering abilities, and you can manage that via the slash subscription endpoints. A new very important for DevOps and ALM scenarios and deployment scenarios is the application API, which is still in beta. The idea is you can list, register, and edit applications that are registered with the AAD and that give you access and allow you to run different workloads and different APIs, applications, and so on and so forth automatically. So again, super useful for, hey, I want to deploy automatically my whole application. Let's deploy that on Azure. Let's deploy this on some kind of web front end or CDN or whatever, and let's create the application at the same time, so everything is automated from end to end. Or okay, I want to send it to the customer. I don't want them to do that step manually because they might be making mistakes. So let's do that again. Or any kind of audit also application. Let's list out all the applications that are here and see which ones are do not sound right. All those kind of things are going to be possible via this API. Let's go to the demonstration. Let's talk about the Delta capabilities. Let us say that I want to track what's going on in my emails and make sure that I'm syncing the content, or I'm tracking what's going on, basically. Maybe for auditing purposes or anything like that, right? This first query is actually going to me, my mail folders. So this is my inbox, my messages. I'm going to for the Delta API, and then I'm adding $filter because I have a lot of messages. So I want to start from now onwards. I don't want to track anything else. As you can see, from today I haven't received anything new, and that what is going to provide to me is a next link. So the idea with that next link is if I execute it, next time when I come back. It can be now, it can be in 2 hours, it can be in 5 hours. It's gonna give me the difference. As I execute that now, again, I'm going to get an empty response because nothing changed in my inbox. I'm not a so busy person. So now let's send a new email to myself here and add a subject and add a body and send it. Let's go back to the graph. Take that new next link. You have to understand that this changes every time you come back and you execute the previous next link. And let's execute that. What you will see is we get a new response, and this time with content, which is basically the email I just sent and to myself, right? Again, super useful for auditing, for syncing content, for any kind of things like that. If I take again this new next link, what's going to happen is I'm not going to see anything because I didn't get anything new in the meantime I was speaking to you. Let's go back to the slides. Let's talk about other important changes that are not service related, that are not technical changes, but that are more like new capabilities for the graph and that are going to solve the business scenarios. Um, Insights are starting moving and changing. So for a long time, Microsoft only had 4 insights, and by insights I mean something that they use intelligence on top of the data they already have to provide some kind of added value. For example, the fine meeting time thing, the people thing, and so on and so forth. So we've seen that me trending around became me/insights/trending. Me working with became me/people. Used is the recently used document, which was not there before, and shared is the share with me documents, which was not there before. Those are new. Some have been moving. The other ones are still there or have been deprecated depending on the type of insights. But Microsoft has been slow with those, but apparently they are finally figuring out a way to deliver those in a consistent manner and in a production ready manner, which is important because this is going to matter on the long run. Also, Intune, as I mentioned before, things like security, devices, identity, compliance, and so on and so forth, has added a huge set of endpoints to the V1 version. Almost 500 of those, and they recently added another 100 to the beta version. So I believe, I'm not an expert with Intune and I'm far from being an IT pro, but I believe now probably most, if not all, the capabilities of Intune are exposed via an API. And again, all that is going to be useful for building company portals that help IT manage devices, users, onboarding people, and even having people leave a company and so on. Project Room. So this could be a dedicated session, and if you want to check it out, there are awesome sessions that came out last week at the Microsoft Build in Seattle, and also last year at the same event at Seattle. The idea is Microsoft is trying to build this comprehensive ecosystem where you have a seamless experience between devices. If you're listening to music on your phone and you go at home and you want to play it on your TV, it should be possible across applications, across devices, OSs, and so on and so forth, and should be seamless. Same thing if I'm editing a document on my phone and I get home and I want to review things, well, I should be able to continue that on my computer without struggling. Where was the document again? Is it synced properly, and so on and so forth, right? Same thing for web pages and so on. The idea is that, and also on a very important thing is that we are redesigning Windows, and that's going to come up in the next couple of months, to surface all those activities, what we call activities, things like listening to music, editing a PowerPoint document, and so on and so forth, right? So this way you have a centralized way across all applications to say, hey, I was watching a movie, I was there, or no, I was editing this document, I was here, right? And just click on that, it opens, and you have a seamless experience. So those are the two changes we are trying to address, being seamless across devices, and also providing you back your context and your activity and kind of footsteps in the past so you can keep going. All of that has SDKs, APIs that are backed by Microsoft Graph, and all of that is V1 today. So let's suppose that you're building your awesome expensing application, right? And you have a version for the desktop and a version for the phone. So for the phone, the application is simplistic. You just want people to click pictures of the bills and the receipts and upload those, right? And on the desktop, you want them to provide more details, why they're doing that, and so on, to bundle those as envelopes. So they say, okay, this was for that trip or this trip. Well, this is if you want them to have a similar experience, now you can implement it. You can say every time they click something, you can add a new activity. You can also provide them with a link to say, okay, I want to continue that on my computer, and all those kind of things. Um, Yeah, so it's basically it regroups in multiple things. As I said, a set of SDKs, set of services, and also OS specific implementations for Windows to provide that great experience. Domains API. So that's going to be mostly useful for those of you that are domain name providers, ISPs, or kind of managing IT for your customers. The idea is you want to check or register a domain within Azure and Office 365 and to check if everything is properly configured and registered on the Office 365 side of things. You have access to that API now, and you can do that. So again, for automation and or big corporations or those kind of things, super useful. That came to V1 recently. Reports and audits. Well, thanks to the GDPR thing, we'll be talking about that a lot. So you have two things. Reports are focused on usage. So how many users are using their mailboxes? Is it daily? How many emails on average are they um, looking at? And it's more like a higher level aggregation view of things to generate charts and stuff like that, right? So recently they added to V1 Microsoft Teams and more information on the existing stuff. And the audit on the other side is focused on granular actions and accountability. Who modified the version? Who changed the permissions of that files and what happened here, right? Think it as a bigger, better version of SharePoint Solid Logs, but for Office 365 and AAD at large. They added a bunch of different resources in beta, so I encourage you to check it out. Other things that I'm just throwing here, you have access to Delve user settings, seeing if they are exposing and seeing things in Delve. You have access to Microsoft Bookings. So Microsoft Bookings is a way for small businesses to say, okay, we are customer facing, but we don't want to spend our time answering phone calls saying, hey, yes, we have a slot for your hairdresser appointment or whatever it is, right? And this is a set of services and APIs that come with Office 365. So as an MCMB, I can set up Microsoft Bookings, put it on my website, and people can book their appointments all by themselves. Well, the APIs are exposed in beta now. All the security alert management, so setting up new security alerts or changing those, you have access to that as well. AD synchronization, so if I have an hybrid scenario, AAD in the cloud, AD domain services on the on premises, and some kind of synchronization going on between them, I can address that programmatically, um, uh, which is going to be again useful for ISP and if you're managing stuff for your customer or very large organizations. Education APIs, so all the things like to manage classrooms, students, and so on and so forth. All of that, not all of it, but some of it came up to the graph, and we're making big investments on that aspect as well. Planner added some things around the context and the favorites and so on and so forth. And there are more and more things, but at some point I'll have to let you go and do other things. We cannot talk forever. So let's jump to the conclusion, and then I will handle the questions. We can see that the Microsoft Graph is a humongous API that provides endless possibilities to you developers to integrate lines of business solutions. If you're working at a final customer, or build tremendous products, services, and solutions on top of it. So I want to encourage you to check it out. Also, stay up to date because things you might not have today. Well, first you can ask those for those on user voice, but they might come up in the next few months or weeks and so on and so forth. It's covering a rich ecosystem, right? It goes from scheduling something, sending messages, collaboration, storing files, managing devices and policies, to managing the infrastructure as an API. It's a wealth of data. We've seen that all the Office 365 data is exposed through the graph, if you have the proper permissions, of course. So again, the I don't know who said that recently, but data is the new gold today, or data is the new oil today. Um, if you want to make money, well, this is where you have to go. So, well, there is a source of data that you can tap into. Um, and because those APIs are very high level and they're very business focused and workload focused APIs, that allows you to focus on the integration and the added value, not on the technicalities. And that's very important because when you were doing first, before that, SharePoint APIs or AWS, those were more technical APIs, and it was more difficult to get into that and to start using those and leveraging those. Lastly, because of all those improvements, you as a developer and your company as an investor have a better productivity, ROI, and everybody's happier because of investments Microsoft is putting together. Thank you very much for listening to me. One thing I will leave you with, besides my contact information, is on the top right corner here, a link to the Microsoft Graph sample. So if you want to see more about what are the capabilities, how it works, in what language, and so on and so forth, this is where you have to go. Thank you very much. Have a really good day. Bye bye.